Hi everybody, we're going to start right on time because we've got a lot to talk about. My name's Jenny Smith and I'm the CEO of the Council to Homeless Persons Victoria's homelessness peak body that's brought this conference to you this couple of days with our conference partners. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to elders past, present, who are here with us today, emerging, and also acknowledge that this land was never ceded. Now, we heard from Minister Wynne this morning some reasonably strong hints about his plans, and it would seem we're going to have some sort of Victorian homelessness strategy or plan before Christmas. So that will be interesting, and it's going to be a strategy, I think, which will hopefully allow us to build on the strengths that we have in our service system, and a plan that will allow us to transform over time to deliver the contemporary evidence-based practice that we know we want to, supported by adequate social housing. But how do we transform ourselves over time? It's one thing to say it. It's going to be quite another thing to do it. In the industry plan that we've worked together on over the last few years, we've spoken about the importance of the role and function of the local area service networks, the LASNs that we already have, to lead service system improvement and increase cross-sector coordination, amongst other things. And we heard from Stephen this morning about the Reaching Home Canadian Homelessness Strategy, which builds on the national partnership strategy that Canada's had in place since 2001. And with 61 designated communities that have put up their hands to develop local plans and strategies. So it seemed to me that with Melanie and Steve in town, it's an opportunity too good to miss, an opportunity that we really should take to have a talk amongst ourselves with them about how they went about that local service development in support of the national plans and the applicability or otherwise of what they've done. So you've already heard about Melanie, and she's going to be our keynote tomorrow morning. But if I could formally introduce Melanie Redmond, co-founder, president and CEO of Away Home Chez Soi in Canada. And Melanie's organisation does a whole lot of different things through a national coalition. It's doing things across Canada, it's doing things internationally. The partnerships just go on. But you'll get to know Melanie a little bit more over the next few days, but I will shut up and hand over to her. And then I think the intention will be that we'll all have a conversation. So there is a microphone on that stand there, so I hope you'll be getting up and using it before too long.
I like that the presentation is in this room, so I have a chance to practice a little bit for the keynote and kind of get the anxiety out. Maybe test run a few jokes with this smaller crowd. But yeah, no, it's wonderful to be here and reflect on this particular topic, because normally I'm talking about youth homelessness and prevention, and that's what I'll be talking about tomorrow. But my team with Away Home are also engaged in a body of work with the Systems Planning Collective. And note I said systems, not system. And so our work is to break open, just the dialogue about the homeless serving systems responsibility to prevent and end homelessness, and to bring in those other systems partners into the dialogue and co-creating solutions. And so with the Systems Planning Collective, we collaborate with the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness with Steve's crew, and also Turner Strategies, to develop tools and resources and build capacity of communities to do this work better. And we've learned a lot in the process. And so being asked to reflect on this topic, I drew on that body of work and everything that we're learning in communities. So The Canadian context I'm going to review a little bit because Steve gave you a lot of information this morning. And so I just want to make sure it's clear how this is playing out in the community context. So again, the federal government, even though there's a national strategy and that's really important, it's actually a drop in the bucket in terms of investment compared to the provinces and territories. And provinces and territories are responsible for all these things. But the federal government plays a huge leadership role. And that's where we see a lot of progress happening. And so the history of the federal homelessness strategy, Ginny was reflecting on. So the National Homelessness Initiative, back in 1999, $338 million. Then the Homelessness Partnering Strategy was the rebrand of that. And then the Homelessness Partnering Strategy had a 5-year renewal with a focus on housing first, and Steve talked about that this morning. And we've just kind of moved out of that and into reaching home. And there are some pros and cons to reaching home. One of the cons is a lot of folks feel that it's actually a mistake to not have requirements around housing first, that was walking a bit backward. But on the pro side, there's community flexibility, which is really important. And so I'm going to be talking about these designated communities that Ginny was speaking to. And so that National Housing Initiative developed these 61 designated communities. The Reaching Home strategy actually has expanded the number of designated communities. And how these designated communities are organized is really important, and we'll talk about governance. You have to have somebody or some entity at the community responsible for receiving the federal dollars and making decisions around how it's all allocated. And so these are community entities, and so I'm going to be talking about those. And sometimes they're the government, they're the city, the municipality, and sometimes they're not-for-profits. And so there are pros and cons that we've learned about that we'll talk about here. Now, the Reaching Home strategy that we have in place right now, Steve went over some of the highlights. Now, that's $4.2 billion. You notice the slide, the mistake again. I'm going to stop outsourcing my slides to Gates here, let me tell you. That's shoddy work. But yeah, it's one of the key features is addressing Indigenous homelessness and doing that through partnership and Indigenous leadership, and that's really key. For me, one of the most important things is that communities can prioritize youth homelessness in a very real way through these dollars, which wasn't the case before. And so there are some mandatory community level outcomes that Steve addressed as well. They present huge opportunities, but also leave a lot of questions because communities are really struggling to figure out, and the government's really struggling to figure out what we mean by prevention. And so a lot of our work is helping them to define that and see what that looks like on the ground. Again, the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples is critical in all of this. So what I thought I would do is take some case studies for Canadian cities of various sizes and walk you through what we think they're doing really, really well and where things aren't going so well. And then we're going to talk at the end about some additional learnings that we're having across all of the communities. And I think these are learnings that will translate in really important ways to other country contexts, to other local contexts as well, because it's a huge trial and error process. I would say that, as to be expected, communities are at different stages of implementation, right? Some communities, before they rolled out the new Reaching Home strategy, had already made a lot of strides in terms of coordinated access, in terms of prioritization of different populations, Indigenous partnership, and other communities just aren't even there, right? And so there are 3 main bodies in Canada that are supporting the implementation of Reaching Home at the community level. And the first is the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. And that's our largest national advocacy body that's generally been focused on solving chronic homelessness, also has an emphasis on veterans homelessness. And so the Canadian Alliance has imported an American campaign called Built for Zero. It was 100,000 homes in the States. Now it's 20,000 homes in Canada because we translated it, but now it's evolved to Built for Zero. And the main focus is supporting communities that want to participate to develop coordinated access for the homelessness system only, right? Coordinated access into those federally funded services, and to have quality by name lists. And so I think there are some communities in Australia that have gone down this, Adelaide, is that? Adelaide, okay. And so outside of that, you have our systems planning collective that's working with communities to engage those other systems and once they do that initial coordinated access, so to build on what they're already doing in the community. And then we have private consultants, and so that's where some of the work goes off the rails, in my opinion. But also there are consultants that do the work really well. And so those are the supports that we have for communities right now. And we need more supports, and I'll tell you. So this is Canada, 37 million people. This is Toronto. And I'm starting with Toronto because that's where we live. And so I feel like I can say some things about Toronto that maybe aren't so pretty, and that's okay because I live there, right? And so one of the things that's important about Toronto is they never fully embraced housing first. They had a number of services already in place through a Streets to Homes program where they said, no, 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 we've been doing housing first forever. But you know what? They hadn't been, right? So basically, and they would say, but it doesn't work. We've been doing housing first forever and it doesn't work. The outcomes are terrible. Well, it's because they were just putting people in housing and throwing the key through the mail slot, like Steve said, and running away. And so that was an initial, that's been a problem in Toronto. Some of the other things that are problematic in Toronto, and you'll recognize this here in Melbourne. So this is a population of Toronto, and this is the vacancy rate. That's what Toronto looks like if you've never seen it. But so this is what we've got in Toronto. So we've got all of the major homelessness advocates shouting, we need more shelter beds. And so they're drowning out every other argument, including the municipal argument, because there are some really smart folks within government at the City of Toronto that know that we need to be investing in prevention and housing and supports. And recently, the government, because of the politicians and the public pressure and the advocates, were forced, and I think something similar may have transpired recently here, were forced to invest the $253 million that they were going to use for supportive housing programs in 27 new shelters. And so again, we're going to have, we're keeping people in homelessness when we could have been using those dollars in other places. So that's a bit tragic on the Toronto front. Let me go back there, actually. A couple of other things that are key about Toronto. And so there are so many contradictions with all these communities. It's very interesting, actually. So at the same time, there are all these challenges in a very disjointed Toronto. They also do really interesting things, like they, with assessment tools, they develop their own strengths-based assessment tools and have rolled those out across the entire homelessness serving sector. And so that's really good. And so I think that's what we're finding in all the communities is for every, kind of what might seem insane thing a community is doing, they're also doing something really well. And I think our collective work is about raising up where things are going really well and what those conditions are, and then helping communities move in those directions. So that's Toronto. Oh, one more thing, because I come from the youth homelessness sector in Toronto originally. One of Steve's students did a cool analysis. Out of all of the youth homeless serving organizations in Toronto, it's about a combined annual $58 million budget. There are about 900 young people who are homeless on any given night in Toronto. And so you think about that math, what that $58 million could do, but they're in shelters, so that's for consideration. We're calling this one, when Steve and I were talking about this presentation, we were like, oh, we better not say what this city is, because what if somebody tweets, right? So we're calling it an unnamed prairie city, okay? And so here are the deets of this one. Oh, I think we're showing you a picture of it, so if you've ever been there. So I think what's key about this city is that the point in time count, the most recent one, revealed that 79% of the folks who are homeless in this prairie city are Indigenous. And so that's key. And so when you're thinking about creating local solutions and developing and implementing these strategies, the first thing that my mind would do is go to Indigenous leadership, Indigenous engagement, how critical that would be. But for this community, and we worked closely with them, so I'm not over-exaggerating what's transpired there. This community, the community entity that controls the resources and leads the development of the strategy is a white organization I think they maybe have 2 Indigenous staff. And the process that they've engaged in was very exclusive of Indigenous voice and leadership, even though from the beginning you had chiefs from all the surrounding rural communities, you had Indigenous leaders from within the town, et cetera, saying, we want to be at the table, we want to help. And so that's an example of where it goes off because you're not doing the work that needs to be done with your Indigenous partners. And the other thing that this community, they refuse to acknowledge their data, and not just the 75% Indigenous content, that data, that reality, but also how many of those people had their first experience of homelessness before they were 25, before they were 18, before they were 16. And so there's no priority on youth homelessness, so they're ignoring the data. And this is key, so it's the communities, there are some communities that are data-driven, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. There is city leadership. They're present, but they refuse to engage in the real change management process, right? And so that's key, like the change management at the community level and how that's supported, we're finding is critical. Okay, so this is Hamilton. So Hamilton, Ontario. This is one of my favorite places because they just are doing so many wonderful things, and so I'll try and just keep it to the high level. So they have municipal leadership. The municipality, the city of Hamilton, is the community entity. So they, have the dollars. They work with community to make decisions around how those dollars are allocated. Data drives all of their decision making in a number of ways, and not just their quality by name list that comes from the campaign that they're part of, the Built for Zero campaign, but other forms of data as well, because there are other forms of data. They also have something called the Street Youth Planning Collective in Hamilton. And so all of the youth service providers, they have 3 tables. They have a table of frontline workers that meet on a regular basis and engage in decision making. They have a table of people with lived experience of youth homelessness, and they have a table of the CEOs, the heads of the organizations. And the decision making at this table, they make decisions if an RFP comes out, if there's a funding opportunity. They all sit down and they make decisions across those 3 tables about who is best poised to go for that funding, and then everyone supports them. And so that level of coordination, that level of collaboration, that builds trust over time, and they're able to do some pretty amazing systems transformation projects right now that we're working on with them. So that's very exciting. In addition, Indigenous engagement and leadership is huge here. And the city has done it well. Like the point in time count was Indigenous developed and led. And so some really key things coming out of there. There's a real culture of innovation that continues to be nurtured. This is a community that looks internationally for solutions. They don't just say, oh, we can't do that in Canada like many of the other communities do. The Housing First for Indigenous people is Indigenous led. They engage in fidelity testing and a culture of continuous improvement around all of their Housing First programs. Training and technical assistance is ongoing. Community of practice around their programs is present and strong, so that's really important. And right now, they're indigenizing coordinated access. So it's being led by Indigenous people in Hamilton. They're indigenizing coordinated access. So they're saying, okay, federal government, you're saying we have to do this, we're going to do it our way. And so the community's created space for them to do that. So I think that's a really important lesson. The last thing as well is they have Housing First for Youth that we've been working with them on, and it's for Indigenous youth, and it's Indigenous led. And so Steve is going to deep dive on that in a session tomorrow afternoon if you're interested. So you start to see the differences in the communities and where things with implementation of Reaching Home are going well and where they're not going so well. Then we'll do one more. Medicine Hat. So have you heard of Medicine Hat before? It was the first community in Canada to reach functional zero, right? And I don't like that term functional zero at all, to be honest. And we've worked with people with lived experience in a Making Zero Count project through Steve's team over the last years. And it turns out people with lived experience don't much like that term either. And so an interesting body of work that we have on an ongoing basis in Canada is, how do you define an end to homelessness? What does that mean for people? And how can we work toward that instead of just functional zero? But Medicine Hat was the first community to reach functional zero. And what's been great about Medicine Hat is working with them around, okay, what are your lessons learned? What would you have done differently out the gates? And so the number one lesson for them is they would have come out the gates at the same time with prevention and housing first. And so I think that has been a huge takeaway for all of the other Canadian communities is, okay, as we're developing and implementing our strategies, let's not just be like, okay, we're putting all our eggs in the housing first basket. Let's put our eggs in the housing first basket and the prevention basket at the same time. And so they've really gone down that road. The other thing that Medicine Hat has realized, and I think a lot of our work is heading in this direction as well, is the work isn't about homelessness. The work is about community well-being. And so instead of having a homelessness strategy moving forward, they have a community wellness strategy called Thrive that takes into account housing, homelessness, et cetera, but also all the other indicators of wellness. And so I think those are some of the key lessons from those communities. But we have some other lessons that I just want to go over briefly before Ginny and I have a talk. Governance. Well, first of all, I actually wanted to say something about coordinated access that I just thought of. One of the challenges with coordinated access in the federal policy is it's only coordinated access for the services that the federal government is funding. So if you think about your community and all of the different services that people access, well, they're funded by, they may not receive any funding from government, but they're not part of that coordinated access. And so, for example, I think, and Ginny, when you visited Calgary, I think they have 90 coordinated access tables, coordinated access to different parts of different services. But the thing is, it's all the same people accessing those services. So this is problematic, and we're going to have to find our way out of this and figure out what it looks like to coordinate across these different systems that are funded by different entities. So that's one thing. Governance models. This is, now, as I went through the case studies, I was highlighting where the municipality, where the city is the community entity, and also where sometimes a not-for-profit is the community entity. So in Edmonton, Alberta, you have something called Homeward Trust, which is the community entity, and it's a not-for-profit that stands outside of government, and it's been able to work magic as an outside entity, right? And then also in Hamilton, I was just talking about, that their community entity is the city, right? And so what makes the difference? At first we thought, wow, it's going to be the outside not-for-profit that's able to really move change in the community because they're not the government and they're able to say and do things that government can't. But some of the most innovative places in Canada right now, the community entity is the government. And so the key seems to be, across all of it, are they engaged in true Indigenous partnership? And do they have the trust of the sector, right? And I think that those two things are key. And so in thinking about all of these different communities and where it's going well and where it's not, those two conditions seem to be some of the magic sauce in doing the work well. Another thing, and this is a module that our System Planning Collective put together if you're interested in different governance models and how those are playing out at the community level. So that's available online. The other key thing we're learning in this implementation is of reaching home, and the strategy before is around assessment and prioritization. So we've seemed to have gotten into this pickle in many communities where folks are sold the idea that a single assessment tool can do everything. It can slice, it can dice, it can do it all, but it can't, right? And so, this is just a diagram that we put together to show where assessment fits in. So you've got your community priorities, intake, then assessment, and then a number of other kinds of assessments that are necessary. And so one tool can't do it all. That's been a huge learning. And also in thinking about assessment and prioritization, the importance of evidence, right? Like, So what's really interesting is in Canada, we went through a huge process with many of our researchers reviewing assessment tools and coming back and making recommendations around what were the best assessment tools and why. And everything that they came to, the conclusions that they came to, everything that they were promoting are strengths-based tools that take into account the knowledge of both the worker and what's coming out through the assessment. So that's really important stuff. And I think a number of communities in Canada are trying to walk back from assessment tools that only look at, to be frank, how fucked up you are. So I think that's a really important learning for all of us. And with the youth homelessness sector, so I lead the National Learning Community on Youth Homelessness, which is a pan-Canadian network of service providers engaged in community of practice. And they requested, they said, we don't like these tools that are out there, these adult tools that they're shoving on us for young people. And so they requested, we want a youth-focused strengths-based tool that's based in other validated measures. And then we want to develop it, and then we want to get it validated, right? So worked with a number of bodies, including the Government of Alberta, to develop the Youth Assessment and Prioritization Tool. And it's currently being validated at the University of Ottawa. And so we'll be rolling that out after the revisions are made based on the validation. It'll be free, open source for any of you. Also, in Canada, the VAT is the tool that has been validated. It was validated by Washington State University. And a number of communities in Canada are using it and are finding it to be really beneficial and helping to overcome some of the challenges of the tools that are not strengths-based. So that's been a huge learning and implementation in Canada. And then finally, there are two things actually. First of all, in implementation, it's been critical that you develop targeted strategies for different priority populations. So it can't be a one-size-fits-all. And the communities that have tried to make it one-size-fits-all, now they're like, wait, actually, we need a strategy for seniors. Oh, we need a strategy for young people. Oh, we need, to consider intersectionality. And then the final thing I think coming out of these early days of implementation in Canada, it's prevention. Everybody wants to do it, but folks don't know what that looks like. And so, Steve was talking about some of our collective work this morning to help not only define it, but also to show communities what it looks like in practice. And that's where the importance of international engagement is key, because all around the world, there are these different pockets of innovation and policy and practice on prevention. And so I think in Canada, we're going to have to keep supporting communities to elevate those things that are working and show how they can work in the Canadian context. So yes, I think those are the key learnings, and I think Jenny's going to grill me for a bit here, and I'm kind of scared of Jenny. I don't know.
I'm such a pussycat, I mean, really. So what about a round of applause? So everybody's going to get a chance to ask some questions, but I might just fill this out a little bit more with Melanie, and then people can, so don't feel frustrated that you're not going to get to ask a question. But so can we just backtrack a little bit to the first national strategy and how the idea for designated communities came up? I mean, I'm trying to get to how Away Home and the hub kind of fit in, and what your authorisation is to do anything and what you do. So if you can tell that story.
That's interesting, our authorization, wow. I think it's just the opposite. There is no authorization, we just do it. But because
so we've got to find a couple of really pushy people, do we, too?
No. So I think the designated communities is really important. That if the federal government was going to have a homelessness strategy, they needed to have a way to organize the homelessness strategy, and they had to have accountability at the community level. And so I think the designated communities, more than anything, are about accountability. And so in provincial jurisdictions, it works differently in every province. So for example, in Ontario, you have these things called service managers. And they can be, embedded within the city, or they can be outside of, and it's really inconsistent. But they're all accountability mechanisms. But I think, what we found over the last, number of years since the original strategy is that they're not just accountability opportunities, they're also huge co-learning opportunities. And so the Government of Canada has engaged in a lot of supporting these community entities and community advisory boards that go along with them to come together and shared learning. And so I think there's a huge community of practice element.
Of them coming together from around the country to learn from each other. Okay.
Yeah, and I think, one of the roles, thinking about A Way Home, or the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, and our role, so I'll just talk about that.
Take your time.
Yeah, so the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, it's based at York University. It's research, and thought leadership. And so, their mandate comes from academia, right? So they have this important, but they've also earned the trust of communities over the years, because the research that they're engaged in is about impacting policy and practice in positive ways. And everything is in partnership with community, et cetera. And so, that their mandate, they earned, I would say. With A Way Home, I was, and I'll talk about this a bit more tomorrow, but I was working, I came in 2013 to the sector from the outside, had never worked on homelessness before, and was working for EVA's Initiatives for Homeless Youth, a youth-serving organization, doing our national initiatives work. And so we started, my job was to run this national pilot project called Mobilizing Local Capacity to End Youth Homelessness. And it was about doing exactly what I was talking about. It was about supporting a set number of communities to develop and implement strategies to prevent and end youth homelessness. And in that work, I will tell you, with those initial pilots, we didn't know what we were doing. I mean, I took the job and I'm like, you want me to what? But I'm not a planner, I'm not a researcher, and none of our staff were, and no one that we had at the table really, they weren't the right people. And so the first job was to get the right people around the table, to get the people with the expertise, coming from all sorts of different angles, different kinds of expertise that could really support those communities to do it well. And so then we started growing the body of knowledge around community-based systems planning. And so then when the government then starts requiring, they went from requiring with the original strategy, they just wanted you to have a plan to end homelessness. And so basically what communities were doing was they were just basically, writing up what they were doing, same old business as usual, and then turning that in, right? That's not a plan to end homelessness. And so our work started emerging around the same time that communities were recognizing they needed real strategies that were going to lead to measurable outcomes. And that coincided with the government saying the same thing. And that was no coincidence. A lot of folks were working to make sure that the strategies that are required have measurable outcomes, and that's really important. And so I think with A Way Home, we haven't been around that long. We launched in 2015 at the end of the year. But I think it's the same thing. I think it's been our willingness to create tools and resources and make them free and available to everybody, but also our willingness to go walk with community. I have staff that I think, my God, they're saints, because they'll just be on the phone for hours with different, folks from community. They just need somebody to listen to what's going on in their community, because it's really difficult work to try and implement these policies that are coming from the federal government that are good, but to implement that at the community level it's very difficult. And depending on where you're sitting, it's a lot of leadership is required, but the leaders need support.
So if you're a designated community out there, like Hamilton or Calgary, and so basically you have put your hand up to get some time-limited funding from the federal government to undertake system change. And the first job was to do a plan, and then the second job was to implement that.
Well,
plan.
the first job, you develop your strategy, but you also have to implement coordinated access. And along with that goes the by name list, which the funny thing is, we joke, most communities we worked with, they've had a list for a long time. And so, it's this new thing, like you're going to have a list. Okay, well, in some communities, the people working there, they know everybody who's homeless by name. They don't need a list. So there are some things that, just play out in really quirky ways, but yeah.
Okay, and so those designated communities would have used that funding to employ project workers to some extent?
Well, there's flexibility. So, for example, if you're a community and you're participating in the Canadian Alliance and the Built for Zero campaign, if you're part of the campaign, you get a set number of supports from the Canadian Alliance. Now, the federal government gave money to the Canadian Alliance for the campaign.
So it's like the peak.
Yeah, yeah. And so they're basically saying, okay, we want you to provide training and technical assistance to the communities that want it from you in the campaign around coordinated access and quality by name list. But there are other communities that don't want to be part of the campaign. They're like, you know what, I think we can do this work without sitting through rah-rah sessions, because I'm from the States originally, so I think it's okay if I say this, but the campaign, because it originates in the States, it's very focused on like, you can do it, woo! We're all in the room together, and it's not really the Canadian style, and I've learned that over the years. And so some Canadian communities, I think, are more comfortable going different routes. And so some communities are, like you said, they're hiring consultants that know how to do this work. Some communities are, working with our teams to do the work. But definitely, communities need a lot of support around capacity development, ongoing training and technical assistance in community practice. And I don't think we have enough resources in Canada right now to help all the communities do this well. And so that's what I'm really nervous about. Then that's when the consultants that basically just, cross out Kansas City on because I'm from Missouri originally, cross out Kansas City and put St. John's, Newfoundland, Labrador, and here's your plan.
On the document.
Yeah. So there's a lot of concern that there's going to be a lot of shoddy work because communities are scrambling. They have basically 2 years, you would say, 2 years to get their coordinated access up and running, their quality by name list, their strategy. They have 2 years. And so you can see already like the consultant buzzards like circling various communities, and yeah. So,
okay. So a designated community gets some funding, it develops its strategy, it's got some access things it needs to have in place. And it marshals those resources and its resources to do that.
yeah.
So where do you guys come in, and how do you come in? And what's been you involved in all of the 61, or just some of the ones that have invited you in?
We are hitting it from 2 angles. One, we could turn ourselves into a private consulting group and go make a lot of money right now, and we know we could. And we have collectively with our systems planning collective, we have, trust of communities, we have a track record, but that isn't our role and should not be our role. Our role needs to be building long-standing capacity. And so what we're doing is we're working with a set number of communities that have invited us in, and in those processes, creating tools and resources that are free and open source that other communities can use. So I'll give an example. Cost modeling tool. So all communities are going to hit this wall where they need to do cost modeling in their strategy. And not a lot of people know how to do that well. But one of our partners in the work, Alina Turner, knows how to do it really well. And so instead of just going community by community and selling her brain on this, we're developing a tool that anybody can use for cost modeling. And developing modules like the one I showed you about governance, around change management, around, all these different learnings around how to develop strategies for various priority populations, partnering with Indigenous communities and partners, all these things So yeah, so to answer your question, we're working with a handful of communities to sharpen our tools so that we can build capacity of others, so.
And how do you fund doing that?
Well, I work nights.
Yeah. Washing dishes, is that right?
I do. I have a night job. No, so we've been really fortunate, and I think the real answer is even funnier. The radical nuns from the prairies. So originally, for Away Home at least, so the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness, they have research grants. They're at a university, so that's a different funding model. They also have hub solutions and do some fee-for-service evaluation work. But Away Home, we have core funding for a number of years from the Radical Nuns from the Prairies, the Catherine Donnelly Foundation, and they're pretty amazing. They believe in longer-term investment, supporting the core, that you actually have to fund administration, et cetera. So they've been wonderful, but also the Home Depot Canada Foundation, so it's our national do-it-yourself, like home hardware store, is a huge partner. And then we have some grants from the Government of Canada that I'll talk about tomorrow. But yeah, no, we're really fortunate that we've assembled a number of funders that believe in longer-term investment because they see the value that we're trying to bring to the national landscape, so.
Wow, philanthropically funded. And if anybody wants to go to the Away Home website, like there are just dozens of high-quality resources there to have a look at. So it's amazing to know that that's done philanthropically. So enough from me. What about a few questions from you? There's a microphone there.
And Steve is also in the room if he can add things in as well.
He's been very well behaved so far.
I know, it's the most quiet I've ever heard him be. Yeah.
Yeah, but Leonie, would you mind, would you be the special microphone person? So this is Mandy, who's been in the sector for a good while, but I think she's down in the Geelong at the moment, at the Geelong project.
We're coming there on Wednesday.
Yeah.
Hi, so yes, Mandy, and I'm from Bowen Child, Youth and Family. I don't know whether I've got a question, but some statements, I guess, and some reflection. Yes, I've been in the sector for a very long time, and probably about a decade or so ago, we were very excited. We had a government that made a commitment around turning off the tap. We were going to halve homelessness by 2020. That's next year. And I've always worked in early intervention, and I really get, I guess, the notion that, I guess, when you're thinking about young people and their family of destination or their family of work, it's truly about working in a relational lens. And often we work in a systems approach, and we often don't think about outcomes or what does the evidence tells us. And I've been watching the Geelong project for a decade now, and I get to work in the Geelong project now too. And often we talk about that it's not just one organisation that builds that. It really is about a collective impact. And I can't really explain. It's about stepping up and stepping into the space, even when it's really scary and it's hard, and people don't understand what your dialogue or your narrative is, because it is about housing. And I always say, what does a home look like for young people? And we can't work in isolation. And so when I look at the Geelong project and other projects like it, it's really about a collection of very committed people and organisations that have the structures. So we have a survey, we have a governance body, we have all of those elements, but we don't stop. We have the conversation always about what does a youth-focused, family-centred approach look like in youth homelessness. And And I always often wonder why we are not there yet. And for every young person, they deserve us to step into that space. And we must not go back into a systems approach. It has to be relational. So I guess, what's my question? It's not really a question, I guess. I'm wanting to explore further ways in the Victorian context how we can do that collectively together with the current government and status, I guess. And others might want to contribute to that conversation.
Oh,
Sorry, I always talk a lot.
No, it's wonderful. It's wonderful, and you're absolutely right. And some of the stuff that I'll talk about tomorrow are getting at outcomes beyond just whether or not young people are housed, and that does require collective impact. It does require the relational. But you know, in thinking about Hamilton that I was talking about, one of the things that's making that community thrive so much, and their struggle to prevent and end all forms of homelessness, is the relational. So it's the relationships, you know, with the Indigenous partners and leaders. It's the relationships, you know, the Street Youth Planning Collaborative, the trust. And it's, you know, in thinking about a systems approach, I think I come at it from the relational as well, right? So, you know, in thinking about the youth sector in Hamilton, where they're really making a lot of inroads is in partnership with schools, because we're starting to go down the Geelong Project Road in Canada, but also with child welfare. And so those relationships between the child welfare workers and the youth homelessness sector are catching young people, you know, and so I think that's critical, that we don't overuse the term systems. Yeah, and that we remember that there's a heck of a lot of emotional and relational labor that goes behind all this work in communities. So yes, amen. And I'm not religious.
Andrew from the Council of Homeless Persons. I just want to pick up on what Molly was saying, because it resonated with something that you said. The work that was done for the Geelong project prior to them getting government funding was already there. So there was this early intervention project, things like that. Where it resonated from what you were saying, what I want to sort of see if we can have lengthen that conversation, was the region was behind the project. The region got behind the project. We had the local area service network that Jenny mentioned before that was behind and supported. So it wasn't just Bowen Child, Youth and Families and the other people in there. It was all of the other services saying, yes, we want to forward that as well. How do we promote that? That's what you sort of said before, is that when that happens, we get successful outcomes, whereas it's otherwise a scramble for funding starting from scratch, which is not best practice and not well-researched thing.
I completely agree, and you know, the community medicine hat that I was talking about, like that's where they're at. They're like, okay, you know, we want wellness in our community. We want everybody to have what they need to thrive, and so how are we all going to get there? Where homelessness services is an important part of that, housing is an important part, schools are an important part. But yeah, no, I don't know that I have any kind of like magic how you get there. Like I think it requires a lot of leadership, right? Like and you know, when I think about the Geelong project and everything I know about it, and I've been a fan for a very long time, I think, you know, I think about the leaders that I know within that have been like banging the drum and doing the difficult work of collective impact. So yeah, that's all I've got. Maybe somebody else has. How do you get there, Steve? What's the magic sauce?
Well,
you've got something to say.
Well, we've talked about this a lot. Like collective impact is really important, but it's one of the hardest things to do because it requires leadership, but it also requires letting go for a larger goal. And organizations are structured and rewarded to prioritize what they do and put that first. And for this kind of work to happen, organizations have to think differently. And so like what's the problem we're trying to solve in the community takes priority over my organization or your organization. And as Melanie says, like how you, the magic to make that happen, it takes a lot of time. The relational is really important. It takes the leadership, though, across, you know, dispersed leadership model, right? So that to get people to think very differently. And it's a change management thing, which is difficult, and it won't always work, right? Because some people will stick and continue to, no, we're just our organization. We're doing all the hard work. The rest of you are doing all the easy work. We're going to go after the funding. So, but I think, you know, one of the things is to just recognize that it is difficult, and there's no easy, straight road to get there.
In Toronto, we have a demonstration project that we're all engaged in, and I'll talk about those a bit tomorrow, on taking family and natural supports programming work across the entire youth homelessness system, so that any young person that touches any aspect of the system is offered that support, and not just offered it once, but offered it over and over, because they may change their mind about wanting that kind of support. And so we have this investment from the federal government, this opportunity to support Toronto, to have it across the whole system. And we have one organization that won't participate because they want to own it. And if they can't own it, they won't participate. And it hurts young people, because there's this opportunity to have the entire system covered with this critical work. And we know that that family and natural support stuff is critical. And we've been trying to work with that organization. Everyone's been trying to get that organization to take off the organization hat and put on the collective good hat, and it's just not working. And so, and you know, that's the stuff that you know, I think leads me to the wine in the evening, but because I can't for the life of me crack that nut. So yeah, I know what you mean.
Hi, Barney Wilson from the City of Melbourne. I was just interested to learn a bit more about your observations of the by name list implementation, and I guess the relationship between how that's been employed and localised service coordination programs. But to also, does that link up between the different designated areas nationally to develop a kind of by name list picture?
Oh, you mean coordinating the by name list across the country for migration?
Yeah, that's right. And I guess, you know, to what extent it's been able to inform more tailored housing planning from a strategic position, rather than just service planning in and of itself.
And I think that's the hope. So I have a number of things to say. I meant to talk about prioritization, so I will talk about that as well. So Tim Richter, that leads the Canadian Alliance, he's also on my board of directors. We all work very closely together. And I think, you know, what the Canadian Alliance is hoping with the by name lists is that over time, you'll be able to start pointing, and Steve was actually helping them put some questions into the by name list and the whole process that would start to get at where people are coming from, so that you could start targeting interventions at different points of contact. So that's the hope, I think, longer term. But there are concerns at the community level that one concern is that not everyone wants to be on the list. And so what does that mean? If you're not on the list, do you not get services? And so we asked the Canadian Alliance what percentage of people across the communities that have by name lists don't want to be on the list. And they're like, oh, it's pretty small. And we're like, well, what's pretty small? They're like, well, about 10%. And we're like, 10%? That's not small. That's a lot of people. And so what do we do about that? So that raises that question. The other question is around prioritization. And so, you know, because I work on youth homelessness, one of the things that we've really supported communities to do is to have not just one decision-making table around prioritization, but to have your youth table with the knowledgeable youth workers and advocates that can make decisions around prioritization, not just, oh, you scored, you know, this, so now you get housing, but, oh, you're, you know, a young woman couch surfing who's pregnant. We're going to prioritize you for housing and support. And so, you know, that's been an important thing. The challenge, though, is the government and the Canadian Alliance and others, they want to make it standardized so that they can roll it out quickly across all the communities. And so in that standardization, you're losing some really important nuances. And so our job is to continue to support communities to nuance it more. I think that's important. But no, to my knowledge, in Canada, there is not yet an effort to link up the by name list so that you have a coordinated strategy around migration. Steve, do you?
Well, there's two levels of, like, by name list is kind of a strategy, but underneath it, there's a data management system called HIFIS. And the challenge around coordinating that across jurisdictions.
Leonie, give that man the mic. You can hear him fine.
The challenge is that it's, even though the systems are decent, like the HIFIS system upon which you place your by name list, the quality of data collection is really uneven. And there's not the discipline or the practice in terms of data collection. And my experience working in the sector is that if you will increase the quality if you can utilize that data at the organization level all the way up to the community level. If people are just asked to collect data at a shelter, they're like, I've got other things to do. There's somebody bleeding on the floor and you want me to enter data. So data quality is something that we're not there yet, not uniformly across Canada. It's very uneven. And so the ability to track people is limited. I mean, if you get the person's full name and their birth date, that can help, but other kinds of, the other challenge is that we don't link the homelessness data with other administrative data, whether it's from corrections or healthcare or anything like that. Like if we could do that kind of work, that's where it would just lift off. But, and that's a hope down the road, but we're kind of at the, even though we've been doing it for, you know, HIFIS has been around for 10 years or more, it's still not quality yet.
No, and the federal government, with this new Reaching Home strategy, they're now developing a data strategy. So they didn't really have one before, except, you know, we're going to help communities have their HIFIS and have, but they even, it was really fraught because with each, and they had to make a data sharing agreement with each individual provider. So there's no like standard agreement across the whole country, and you can only do certain things with that person, that organization's data. So it's very limited.
Yeah, and another challenge with doing coordinated access and by name lists is that the community entity has federal funding, and so they'll fund some organizations in the community. The municipality might fund some organizations, but there are many organizations that aren't funded. And so they have very little stick to ensure that everyone participates in the by name list, in the coordinated access, or in the HIFIS system. So that you can have like really important gaps, like in the city of Calgary, for instance, one of the most advanced cities in all of this. They had fairly good coverage, except for the longest time, the largest emergency shelter in the country opted out. So like a purpose-built 600-bed shelter, which is a horrifying approach, but they were outside of the whole HIFIS system.
And you could have a situation where communities are claiming that they've reached functional zero and be stepping over people left or right on the street. Yeah. So I think that's the danger that we have.
So getting that coverage across your community, there's all kinds of challenges around setting that up well.
Yes, because only the projects that were funded out of the federal money had to be in the database, but the new version of the plan's requiring everybody to be in it, which will make a bit of a difference. Yeah. Anybody got a question? Oh yes, Ruth.
Hi, I'm Ruth. I'm from the Southern Homelessness Services Network. So we're one of the local area service networks covering the south of Melbourne, now members of the funded homelessness services. And we run from sort of inner city all the way to sort of outer metro Melbourne rural edge. And I guess I share your and Stephen's concern about the push for more shelters. I'm hearing this a lot in my work in our communities and our areas, and you know, church groups wanting to set up camp stretchers and give soup like you were talking about. And I guess I am concerned because of our, I guess our federal government has demonstrated, hasn't really demonstrated understanding the complexity of homelessness, and I'm worried that they may be taking us further down that pathway with the community build. So how do we counter, I guess, that push for more shelters?
Yeah, no, that's a tough one. You know, first of all, when the federal government was developing this new Reaching Home strategy, they did something kind of wonderful, and I think they did this really well. They went cross-country and did deep consultations in communities across the country on homelessness, and they didn't take it for granted that they knew everything about homelessness or understood the complexity or anything. And so I think what actually emerged in the recommendations to the federal government from this council, they're sound, very sound. Now, not all of that made it into the actual federal policy because there were resource implications. But so I think that they did that really well. You know, I continue to think in Toronto what we have to do is we have to show other narratives. We have to show where something else is working really well other than just building shelter beds. And I think we're fortunate in Canada we have some of those success stories to lift up. But we need to be louder than, and it's unfortunate because in Toronto, it's the advocates that are yelling for more shelter. It's not the public, it's not the politician, it's the advocates. And they're the old school advocates that, you know, yes, it was critical that we open shelters and have emergency services when homelessness was on the rise. But now we need to do some other things or we're going to be doing this in 20 years. And so we need to be louder than them, but we have to be pointing at solutions, not just saying, you know, shelters are passé. Well, what the hell else are we going to do? You have to be ready to show what that's going to look like.
So Melanie, earlier on in your presentation, you talked about the National Alliance. It's Tim Richter's. Yeah, and that they had some units of support out of the strategy implementation to give to communities that wanted them. Could you talk a little bit more about what the role of Be the Closest to a Peak that you've got in Canada and what their role
The Canadian
is?
Alliance?
Yeah.
So I think, you know, they host the annual conference every year, the national conference. So they play a huge convening role. You know, they work with all of us to elevate, you know, what's working across communities. They elevate research. They do all of those things that are really critical. The other thing that they do, and I think they do really, really well, is they give communities something that they can attach to if they're feeling like they don't know what to do about homelessness. And I think that that's the real value of the campaign, is that communities that are lost, politicians that are lost, they can come into community and at least start to move the dial through the campaign. So I think there's real value in that, but I think you also have to have other entities that are filling in some of the other gaps and doing some of the other heavy lifting. I don't think any one national or regional or local organization can do this on their own. I think you got to get a lot of, you know, I think the other thing that's critical is that you coordinate your efforts. And so that's what we do with the Canadian Alliance. Even if we disagree about some things, like, we're like, okay, you're taking that on. One example is they do a lot of training around one of the assessment tools, quality by nameless, et cetera. Well, it's not an assessment tool I'm particularly interested in. And so we had a dialogue about, well, why don't we train on the other tools that we prefer? And they'll train on the tools. And so, you know, we disagree about the tools, but we agree that training and technical assistance is needed, and so let's divide it up. So I think, you know, coordinating those national and regional organizations and efforts so that you're not stepping on each other's toes is really important. Yeah, and that requires hard conversations too, right? Yeah.
So Leonie, I wondered if you give the microphone to Stephen, because we've got 5 minutes to go, and I thought I might ask Melanie and Stephen to just reflect on, you know, your collaborative experience of supporting change management in Canada and accept that we're asking for your advice. I mean, if we were starting, we're not starting from scratch, we've got our own structures, but if we were starting from scratch, what advice would you give us about what to do and what not to do from, you know, the decade of experience that you've had both watching this and participating in it and supporting it?
Do you want to start? I can start.
Well, I think the first thing is to have a vision, right? So maybe you should talk about that with the way home, because that was really important. Like developing a clear vision that distinguishes, that articulates what you want to have happen and creates a space for that to happen. And then from there you work out, okay, how are you going to?
Yeah, no, I think the important lessons for me over the last many years is that the homelessness serving sector are critical stakeholders. But there are all of these other folks that we have to be working with on this. It can't just be so, and I'll talk about this tomorrow. So you can sleep in if you want, because I'll repeat a few of the things today. So, but you know, recognizing that homelessness, youth homelessness, homelessness writ large is a fusion policy issue, and recognizing that, you know, for the longest time we've dumped the responsibility to prevent and end homelessness on service providers. And that's just crazy. They can't do that. And when, you know, when I started working on the issue, the National Learning Community on Youth Homelessness, they thought their job was to prevent and end youth homelessness in Canada. And I was like, well, how the hell are they going to do that? And then, you know, and just starting to think about, okay, who, you know, the funders, the philanthropic community, where are they at in this, and how do we bring them along, and what role can they play in all of this complexity? And, oh, you know, over here, we've got the researchers. What role can they play, and how do we bring them together to do some of the heavy lifting with us? And then the same with policymakers. What role do they play as partners? And I think that that's been the most critical shift away from where things were about 10 years ago, is pulling all of those players together and to attempt what has made my hair so much more gray. It's collective impact.
I agree. I think that was what Way Home has done better than any national organization, is like pull all these different players to the table and get them to collaborate in new ways. And because, you know, you're going to work from where you're from. And so like with our work with the observatory, we've always felt our role is to do research, provide the evidence base, to shine the light where there isn't evidence, and we keep doing the same thing in spite of evidence even. And so research it was a long-term battle to get people to see the value of research in this work. And so we had to build up that trust, but to be part of a table with, you know, what you did with the Way Home, all these key stakeholders, to get them to work together and focus on this one piece of work. And then you talked before, Melanie, about collaboration with Canadian Alliance, right? So Canadian Alliance's mission is what I spoke about this morning, you know, the planning, housing first, and prioritizing chronically homeless people, and all of which are very important, right? So not knocking that, but how does our body of work plug into that? They're not interested in prevention, the Canadian Alliance, but we are, so that's good. So how do we structure the work? So figuring out that collaboration piece is really the key thing, and when it works well, it works really well. But you had to bring people along on that, because there was a lot of resistance to collaboration. You would think, like everybody, there's no one in this room who's going to stand up and say, collaboration sucks. I hate collaboration. It's the worst thing ever. It's, you know, everybody agrees collaboration is a good thing, but not everybody really wants to do it. So to get there was quite a thing, and, you know, to do that very quickly.
You also, there's a huge role that inspiration plays in communities, and sometimes, and we do this as well. Sometimes you need to bring people from away, for example, to, come in and say what you've been saying for the last 20 years, but because it's somebody with a different accent, somehow it's new.
We're very appreciative as well.
Exactly. I'm fine being used, Jenny. I'm just fine. But also, you have so many inspirational people within your midst, but going out and inspiring communities to think and work differently is a huge part of the work as well.
And one of the things, so in coming to Australia for the second time, I've always looked here for inspiration, and the challenge you have here is one we would have in Canada or the United States, that a lot of innovation stays really close to the ground, right? And so just trying to understand out there, where are there really interesting, innovative approaches? Not that we should just look for, follow the shiny object for newness, but there's a lot of really good knowledge about how to do things all across the country. And so one of our strategies we've been working on all along, but going forward, is we really want to have a better understanding and start to pull together what are those really good practices that are going to prevent and end homelessness, and shine the spotlight on them, and do that in different ways. And in addition, give communities the resources if they say, oh, that Geelong project's really cool. What if we did something like that over here? Because most organizations don't have the resources to develop out, program model guides or, operations manuals, these kinds of things. And so that kind of identifying what is really good, shining a spotlight on it, and developing resources so others can copy it. And from our perspective, making it as free as possible, right? That we're not going to be proprietary or try to make.
So I think we could go on for some time. We've we have been going for some time. Rob Prattlin over by the door wants to ask a question, but we are out of time, so I might invite Rob to come up and maybe ask his question once I close the session. But thank you all for being here, for making it such a good conversation. Thanks heaps, Melanie. I think we'll all be out of bed and here for you in the morning. And thanks, Steve, also for contributing. It's afternoon tea time. Come back. It's going to be just so exciting straight afterwards on mental health.